Welcome to the Before Bed channel, your place to unwind, relax, and drift into sleep with fascinating stories and unforgettable tales.
My name is Noah, and tonight I have a story for you called The Town Where Nobody Ever Says Goodbye. Before we begin, let the noise of the day slowly fade away. Make yourself comfortable, close your eyes if you wish, and take one quiet breath. There is nowhere else you need to be right now. And when you're ready, let the story begin. Julian Mercer had always believed that getting lost was simply a matter of taking the wrong road. At 42, he had driven across enough unfamiliar towns to know that every wrong turn could eventually be corrected. But on one quiet autumn evening, beneath a sky slowly filling with stars, Julian took a road that did not appear on his map and arrived somewhere he would never be able to explain. The road appeared shortly after sunset, branching away from the highway between two rows of dark pine trees. Julian was tired after hours of driving and thought it might lead to a village where he could find a room for the night. There was no sign at the entrance, only an old stone marker covered in moss. Still, warm lights glimmered somewhere beyond the trees, so Julian turned the car toward them. The road curved gently downhill for nearly 20 minutes. His phone lost its signal. Then the map on his screen froze completely. Julian considered turning around, but the road behind him had become strangely difficult to see beneath the evening mist. Ahead, however, more lights appeared, soft amber windows, old street lamps, and the outline of rooftops nestled quietly between wooded hills. The town was smaller than Julian expected, perhaps only a few hundred homes gathered around a narrow main street. Most of the buildings looked old, but carefully maintained, with wooden porches, flower boxes, and lamps glowing beside their doors. Nothing about the place felt abandoned. In fact, it seemed unusually peaceful, as though the town had somehow learned how to remain untouched by the hurried world beyond the hills. Julian drove slowly through the main street, searching for a hotel. A baker was closing his shop. An elderly couple sat together beneath a street lamp. Somewhere behind an open window, someone was playing a piano so softly that the melody seemed to drift through the night air. Several people looked toward Julian's unfamiliar car, but instead of suspicion, they offered small, welcoming smiles. Near the center of town, Julian found a modest inn called the Lantern House. A brass bell hung above the entrance, and warm light spilled across the wet pavement outside. He parked beneath an old maple tree and stepped into the cool evening. For reasons he could not explain, the moment he closed the car door, he felt as though the silence around him had been waiting for his arrival. Inside, the inn smelled faintly of cedarwood, tea, and something sweet baking in the kitchen. Behind the desk stood a woman in her late 60s with silver hair tied neatly behind her head. She introduced herself as Evelyn Hart and seemed neither surprised nor curious to see a stranger arrive so late. "You must be tired," she said gently. "Most people are when they find us." Julian smiled at the unusual choice of words. "Find you?" he asked. "I was only looking for somewhere to sleep." Evelyn returned his smile, but did not explain. She handed him an old brass key marked with the number 12 and told him breakfast would be served whenever he woke. There were no forms to sign, no request for identification, and no mention of payment. Julian found that stranger than he wanted to admit. Before going upstairs, Julian asked the name of the town. Evelyn paused for just a moment before answering. Linden? The name sounded ordinary enough, yet Julian was certain he had never seen it on any map. He took out his phone to search for it, but there was still no signal. Evelyn watched him for a moment and said softly, "Maps are very good at showing us where places are, not always why we find them." Julian was halfway up the stairs when the front door opened behind him. A young man stepped inside, embraced Evelyn warmly, and said he was leaving town before sunrise. Evelyn wished him a safe journey and told him to take care of himself. The young man smiled, hesitated as if searching for one final word, then simply said, "Until whenever." Julian stopped on the stairs. It was the first time he noticed that nobody had said goodbye. The next morning, Julian woke to the sound of church bells drifting gently across the town. For a few seconds, he forgot where he was. Pale sunlight entered through the curtains, and somewhere below, dishes clinked softly in the dining room. Linden seemed even quieter in daylight. From his window, Julian could see people opening shops, sweeping porches, and greeting one another, as if every morning had all the time in the world. At breakfast, Evelyn served warm bread, honey, eggs, and tea without asking what Julian wanted. Strangely, everything was exactly what he would have chosen. He mentioned the young man from the night before and asked where he had gone. Evelyn buttered a piece of bread and said, "Beyond the hills, I suppose." Julian waited for more, but she only added, "People leave Linden from time to time." Julian asked whether the young man was coming back. Evelyn's hand paused for the smallest moment before she reached for the teapot. "Perhaps," she said, "perhaps not." Julian remembered the strange farewell from the night before. He didn't say goodbye. Evelyn looked at him then, and the warmth in her expression faded just enough for Julian to notice. "No," she replied quietly. "He didn't." Julian expected an explanation, but Evelyn simply asked whether he had slept well. He understood the change of subject and decided not to push. After breakfast, he went outside, intending to check his car and continue his journey. The engine started immediately, but the navigation system still showed nothing except a blank gray screen. Even stranger, the road he remembered taking into Linden seemed to have vanished beyond the edge of town. He drove toward the northern edge of Linden, certain he would recognize the road once he reached it. Instead, every street curved gently back toward the center of town. Julian tried another direction, then another. Each time, he somehow returned to the same stone fountain in the square. After the fourth attempt, an old shopkeeper, watching from his doorway, smiled and called, "You won't find your way by hurrying." Julian parked the car and approached him. The shopkeeper introduced himself as Thomas Bell, owner of the town's clock shop. His window displayed dozens of old watches, pocket clocks, and wooden timepieces, all ticking at slightly different rhythms. Julian asked directly how to leave Linden. Thomas considered the question for a moment, then said, "The road usually becomes easier to see once a person is ready to use it." Julian laughed, assuming the old man was joking, but Thomas did not laugh with him. "Is everyone in this town determined to speak in riddles?" Julian asked. Thomas smiled. "Only when the truth would sound stranger." He invited Julian inside for coffee, and with nowhere else to go, Julian accepted. As he entered, he noticed a small wooden sign beside the door. "We repair clocks. We do not repair time." They sat near the back of the shop while hundreds of clocks filled the silence with gentle ticking. Julian asked how long Thomas had lived in Linden. "All my life," the old man replied, "and my father before me." Then Julian asked whether people often became lost on the road and arrived there by accident. Thomas looked toward the window. "People arrive in many ways. Accident is only one name we give to things we do not understand yet." Before Julian could ask another question, a woman entered the shop carrying a small travel case. Thomas greeted her warmly and repaired the clasp on an old wristwatch she handed him. When she turned to leave, she said, "I'll be gone for a while." Thomas nodded and replied, "Then may the road be gentle with you." The woman smiled. Neither of them said goodbye. When the door closed, Julian leaned forward. "That's twice now." Thomas knew exactly what he meant. The ticking clock suddenly seemed louder. Julian continued, "Nobody here says goodbye, do they?" For several seconds Thomas said nothing. Then he placed his coffee on the table and looked at Julian with an expression that was neither frightened nor surprised. "No," he said, "and if you stay in Linden long enough, I suggest you don't say it either." Julian studied Thomas's face, waiting for the smile that would reveal the whole thing as a local joke. It never came. "What happens if someone says it?" Julian asked. Thomas turned toward the shelves and began adjusting a row of clocks that did not need adjusting. "Nothing happens immediately," he said. "That is what makes the word dangerous. At first it sounds like any other word." Julian waited, but Thomas seemed unwilling to continue. Finally he said, "A word cannot be dangerous by itself." Thomas nodded slowly. "Usually you would be right." Outside, a bicycle bell rang somewhere in the square, followed by children laughing. The town looked too gentle to contain anything frightening, and perhaps that was what unsettled Julian most. Linden did not feel like a place hiding a terrible secret. It felt like home. Thomas poured more coffee into Julian's cup. "In Linden, people say, 'Until tomorrow,' 'Until next time,' or simply, 'Be safe.' We leave the ending open." Julian smiled faintly. "You make it sound as though goodbye closes something." Thomas looked toward one of the oldest clocks on the wall. "Sometimes it does. And some things, once truly closed, are more difficult to open than people imagine." Julian left the clock shop with more questions than answers. The morning had become bright and mild, and Linden was beginning to feel almost ordinary again. A grocer arranged apples outside his shop. 2 women watered flowers beneath their windows. An old dog slept in a patch of sunlight beside the fountain. Julian wondered whether the strange rule had simply grown from superstition, repeated so long that nobody remembered how it began. Near the fountain, Julian noticed the woman from Thomas's shop, sitting alone with her travel case beside her. She was perhaps 35, with auburn hair and a calm, thoughtful face. Julian asked whether she was waiting for someone. "For the afternoon coach," she replied. Then she smiled. "You're the stranger staying at Evelyn's place, aren't you?" In Linden, Julian was beginning to realize strangers did not remain strangers for long. Her name was Mara Ellison. She had grown up in Linden, but had decided to leave for a coastal town where her sister lived. Julian asked whether she expected to return. Mara looked toward the hills before answering. "I hope so." Something in her voice made the words feel heavier than they should have. Julian almost asked about the town's rule, but before he could, Mara said, "Thomas told you, didn't he?" Julian nodded. "Only that I shouldn't say goodbye." Mara gave a quiet laugh that carried very little amusement. "That sounds like Thomas. He always tells the smallest part of the truth first." Julian sat beside her. "Then tell me the larger part." Mara ran her fingers along the handle of her suitcase. "People here believe that when you say goodbye and truly mean it, Linden begins letting that person go." "Letting them go where?" Julian asked. Mara looked at him carefully. "Not where. From whom?" For a moment, Julian thought he had misunderstood. Mara continued softly. "At first, people forget little things. The sound of the person's laugh, the color of their coat, the way they took their tea. Then larger things begin to fade. Stories, birthdays, arguments, promises. Eventually, even the face becomes difficult to remember." Julian glanced around the peaceful square. "You're saying people disappear from memory because someone says goodbye?" Mara shook her head. "Not everyone. Only those who leave Linden after the word is spoken with the intention that the ending is real." She paused. "That is why nobody here says it casually. We learned a long time ago that some words become powerful when the heart agrees with them." Before Julian could respond, a distant bell sounded from beyond the square. Mara stood and lifted her travel case. "That will be my coach." Julian watched several townspeople approach to embrace her. They told her to write, to stay warm, to remember the road home. Not one person said goodbye. Then an elderly woman pushed through the small crowd, took Mara's face gently in both hands, and began to cry. The elderly woman was Mara's mother. She held her daughter for several moments without speaking, as though words had suddenly become too fragile to trust. Mara whispered that she would write as soon as she arrived. Her mother nodded and pressed a small folded handkerchief into Mara's palm. "Then write before the sea makes you forget us," she said with a trembling smile. The coach arrived beneath a cloud of dust and the soft ringing of harness bells. Mara placed her case inside, then turned toward the people gathered around her. One by one they offered words that sounded like endings without ever becoming one. "Until winter." "Until your first letter." "Until you come home." Julian noticed how carefully each phrase left a little space for return. When the coach began to move, Mara leaned from the window and raised her hand. Her mother followed beside it for several steps before stopping near the fountain. Julian watched until the coach disappeared around the bend. Nobody waved for very long. Nobody called after her. The square simply became quiet again, carrying the strange feeling of a sentence that had been intentionally left unfinished. Julian remained near the fountain after everyone else had gone. Mara's explanation sounded impossible, yet the emotion he had just witnessed was real. These people were not performing some old superstition for a visitor. They were protecting something. He wondered how many farewells had taken place in this square before the town learned to fear one ordinary word. That afternoon, Julian returned to the lantern house and found Evelyn trimming flowers beside the front window. He told her what Mara had said. Evelyn did not deny it. She placed the scissors on the table and looked toward the empty street. "Mara's family remembers better than most," she said. Her grandmother taught them to keep letters, photographs, recipes, anything that helps a memory hold its shape. Julian asked whether photographs could prevent someone from being forgotten. Evelyn shook her head. "They can remind the eyes," she said, "but memory lives in more places than the eyes." A photograph could preserve a face while the sound of a voice disappeared. A letter could preserve words while the feeling behind them faded. "Remembering someone," Evelyn said softly, "is more complicated than keeping proof they existed." "Has it happened to you?" Julian asked. Evelyn became still. For a few seconds, the only sound in the room was the faint ticking of the clock above the fireplace. Then she smiled, though her eyes had grown distant. "There was once someone whose name I promised myself I would never forget." Julian waited. Evelyn looked down at her hands. "I kept the promise longer than I kept the name." Julian did not know what to say. Evelyn walked to an old cabinet and opened a small drawer. Inside lay a faded photograph of a young man standing beside the river. His features were still clear, but nothing was written on the back. "I know that I loved him," Evelyn said. "I know he mattered. But some mornings, that is almost all I have left." She explained that the young man had left Linden many years ago after an argument. They had both been angry, and Evelyn had followed him to the edge of town. Believing she would never see him again, she had shouted the word after him. At first, nothing changed. Then weeks became months, and details began slipping away so gently that she did not notice until too much was already gone. Julian looked again at the photograph. "Did he forget you too?" he asked. Evelyn closed the drawer carefully. "That is the part no one in Linden truly knows." She returned to the window and watched the evening light settle across the street. "We know what happens to those who remain. We know how memory fades here, but we have never known what happens in the hearts of those who leave." That night, Julian lay awake longer than usual. Rain tapped softly against the window, and the old inn creaked as the wood cooled. He kept thinking about Evelyn's photograph and the man whose face remained while his name had disappeared. There was something deeply unsettling about remembering the shape of a love while losing the person who had once filled it. Julian had lost people before. His father had died when Julian was 31, and several friendships had quietly ended without argument or explanation. Yet those losses had never frightened him in this way. He could still remember his father's laugh and the voices of friends he had not seen in years. In Linden, loss seemed capable of taking even the memories that made grief possible. The next morning, Julian found a small envelope waiting beneath his door. There was no stamp and no name on the front. Inside was a short note written in careful handwriting. "If you want to understand why Linden fears goodbye, come to the old library after sunset. Ask for the room without books." Julian read it twice before slipping it into his coat pocket. He spent the day wandering through Linden, trying not to think about the note. The town remained peaceful. Children carried school books beneath their arms. Shopkeepers greeted one another across the street. Someone hung fresh laundry behind a white wooden house. Julian found himself wondering how many people around him had already forgotten someone they once believed they could never forget. Near noon, Julian passed a small schoolyard where a teacher was helping children write letters. One boy raised his hand and asked how to end a letter to someone who had moved away. The teacher smiled and said, "Write until I hear from you again." The children accepted the answer without question. Julian realized the rule had been taught so gently that even the youngest residents carried it without fear. After sunset, Julian followed a narrow lane behind the church and found Linden's library. It was a tall stone building covered in ivy, with warm light glowing behind arched windows. An elderly librarian sat behind the desk, reading beneath a green lamp. When Julian asked for the room without books, she did not seem surprised. She simply closed her novel and said, "You took longer than I expected." Her name was Agnes Vale, and she had cared for the library for nearly 40 years. She led Julian through rows of old shelves and down a staircase beneath the building. At the bottom was a narrow hallway ending in a plain wooden door. Agnes placed her hand on the handle, but did not open it immediately. "What you see inside may seem ordinary," she said. "That is why it matters." The room contained no books at all. Instead, hundreds of small wooden drawers covered every wall from floor to ceiling. Each drawer carried a handwritten name and a date. Some labels were fresh and dark. Others had faded until the letters were almost impossible to read. Julian stepped closer to one drawer and asked what they contained. Agnes answered softly, "Things left behind by people Linden is beginning to forget." Agnes opened one drawer. Inside lay a blue ribbon, a train ticket, and a folded recipe written on yellowing paper. "These belong to a woman named Margaret Lane," she said. "She left 32 years ago." Julian asked whether Agnes remembered her. The librarian thought for a long moment. "I remember that she was kind," she finally said. "But I no longer remember the sound of her voice." Julian slowly looked around the room again. Hundreds of names surrounded him, each one belonging to a person who had once laughed, argued, cooked meals, fallen in love, and walked the streets above them. Now, some remained only as objects inside quiet drawers. Agnes watched him take it in and said, "This room exists because forgetting is easier when no one notices it happening." Julian stepped closer to the drawers and noticed that some contained only a single object, while others held letters, photographs, buttons, rings, or scraps of cloth. Agnes explained that families sometimes brought things here when they began forgetting details they were afraid to lose. "Objects cannot restore a person," she said, "but sometimes they can hold a door open for a little longer." At the far end of the room, Julian noticed one drawer without a name. Instead, its label read simply, "Unknown." He asked Agnes who it belonged to. She looked at it for a long moment. "That is the saddest kind," she said. "Someone was remembered long enough for their belongings to be saved, but not long enough for anyone to remember whose belongings they were." Julian felt a quiet weight settle over him. He had always thought forgetting happened naturally, 1 year at a time, as life filled itself with newer things. But here, memory seemed almost physical, something that could thin, weaken, and disappear while everyone continued living around the empty space it left behind. "Why doesn't everyone simply refuse to leave?" Julian asked. Agnes smiled sadly. "Because staying forever can become another kind of loss." She explained that people left Linden for love, work, family, curiosity, or simply because something beyond the hills was calling them. "A town that protects memory by trapping people inside it," she said, "would not be protecting love. It would be protecting fear." Julian thought of Mara traveling toward the coast. Her family had not asked her to stay, even though they knew what could happen if the wrong word were spoken. They had chosen uncertainty over possession. For the first time, Julian understood that Linden's strange custom was not really about preventing people from leaving. It was about trying to love them without declaring that their absence had become permanent. Agnes closed the drawer and led Julian toward another section of the room. Here, the labels looked newer. One name caught his attention: Samuel Hart. Julian recognized Evelyn's surname immediately. The drawer had been opened often. The wood around its handle was worn smooth. Julian looked at Agnes. "Is this the man in Evelyn's photograph?" Agnes did not answer immediately. Instead, she opened the drawer. Inside was a pocket knife, a faded photograph of two young people beside the river, and a stack of letters tied with green thread. On the first envelope, Julian could still read the words, "To Evelyn, when I find the courage to come home." Agnes touched the bundle gently. "Yes," she said, "his name was Samuel." Julian stared at the letters. "Then why doesn't Evelyn remember his name?" Agnes sighed. Samuel had written from outside Linden for years, but the letters had never reached Evelyn. Some had been returned. Others had somehow arrived at the library instead. By the time Agnes discovered what they were, Evelyn had already begun forgetting. "Memory fades quietly," she said. "Sometimes truth arrives after the door has nearly closed." "Does Evelyn know these letters are here?" Julian asked. Agnes nodded. "She does. But every time she reads them, they feel as though they were written to someone she used to be." Julian looked at Samuel's handwriting again. A man had spent years trying to return through words, while the woman he loved slowly lost the path back to him. Agnes carefully closed Samuel's drawer. "This is why people in Linden fear endings," she said. "Not because every person who leaves disappears, but because we never know which farewell will become the last one." Julian followed her toward the stairs in silence. Before they left the room, he looked back at the hundreds of drawers and wondered how many endings had been spoken before anyone understood what they were losing. Julian returned to the lantern house beneath the sky filled with thin clouds and pale moonlight. Evelyn was still awake, sitting near the fireplace with a cup of tea in her hands. For a moment, Julian considered telling her about Samuel's letters, but when he saw how peacefully she was watching the fire, he hesitated. Some truths, he realized, could be kind and painful at the same time. Evelyn looked up and asked whether the library had answered his questions. Julian sat across from her. "It gave me more questions," he said. She smiled. "Then Agnes showed you the right room?" Julian studied Evelyn's face carefully, wondering how much of Samuel still lived somewhere beneath the forgetting. "Do you ever wish you could remember everything?" he asked. Evelyn thought for a while before answering. "Once, yes, desperately." She turned her cup slowly between her hands. "But memory is not a room we can force open. Sometimes the harder we pull at a fading thing, the more we hurt ourselves with what remains." Julian expected sadness in her voice, but heard something gentler instead. "Now I try to be grateful for what stayed." She told Julian that she no longer remembered Samuel's voice, but she still felt calm near the river where they had once spent long afternoons. She could not remember every conversation, but certain songs still made her unexpectedly happy. Perhaps memory leaves traces even after the details disappear, she said. Maybe love sometimes survives as a feeling long after we forget what first gave it a name. Julian remained quiet. He had always thought remembering meant being able to tell the story correctly, names, dates, places, exact words. Evelyn seemed to be suggesting something different. Perhaps memory also lived in the body, in the comfort of a familiar road, the warmth of a melody, or the strange sense that a place mattered even when we no longer knew why. The following morning, a letter arrived for Evelyn. Julian happened to be in the dining room when the postman handed it over. The envelope carried a coastal postmark and Mara's familiar handwriting. Evelyn smiled and immediately called for Mara's mother, who lived only a few streets away. Within an hour, several neighbors had gathered around the table to hear the letter read aloud. Mara wrote that she had reached the coast safely. She described the smell of salt in the air, the gulls calling above the harbor, and her sister's small blue house overlooking the sea. She promised to write again soon. Her mother listened with both hands wrapped around her tea, smiling through tears. When Evelyn finished reading, the room became quiet, but this time the silence felt full rather than empty. Julian watched Mara's mother fold the letter carefully and place it inside her coat. "Does receiving a letter help?" he asked later. She nodded. "It gives memory somewhere to rest." Then she smiled. "But mostly, it reminds me that she is still living a life beyond what I can see." Julian liked that answer. It made distance feel less like disappearance and more like a story continuing in another room. That afternoon, Julian walked toward the edge of Linden again. This time, he went on foot. The road seemed clearer than before, winding gently between the trees until it disappeared beyond the hills. He could have followed it. Nothing blocked his way. Yet when he reached the old stone marker, he stopped. For the first time, the question was no longer whether he could leave. It was why he had not yet chosen to. Julian stood there until the light began to fade. Beyond the marker waited the life he had left behind. Work, responsibilities, unanswered messages, familiar streets, and people who expected him to return. Behind him, Linden glowed softly between the hills. He realized he had spent his first days in the town trying to find the road out. Now that the road was visible, something inside him was asking for a little more time. Julian returned to town after sunset and found Linden unusually quiet. The shops had closed early, and only a few windows remained lit along the main street. When he reached the lantern house, Evelyn was standing outside with a shawl around her shoulders, watching the road. "I wondered if you had left," she said. Julian shook his head. "Not yet." Evelyn smiled. "Then come inside. The tea is still warm." Inside, the fire had burned low. Julian sat across from Evelyn and told her that the road out of Linden had finally appeared. She did not seem surprised. "It usually does," she said. Julian looked at her. "Then why did it disappear before?" Evelyn stirred her tea slowly. "Maybe it never disappeared. Maybe you were simply looking at the road before you were ready to see where it led." Julian asked how long strangers usually stayed in Linden. Evelyn smiled. "Some stay one night. Some stay months. A few stay forever." She looked toward the window. "People leave when there is something outside they are ready to return to." Julian thought about the life waiting beyond the hills. For the first time, he realized that leaving a place and running away from it were not always the same thing. The next few days passed gently. Julian began helping Evelyn carry firewood, visited Thomas at the clock shop, and spent quiet afternoons reading in the library. He no longer felt like a visitor, though nobody had formally invited him to stay. Linden had a way of making time feel wider, as though hours contained more room than they did elsewhere. Julian found himself wondering how much of his old life had been lost simply to rushing. One afternoon, Thomas asked Julian to help carry a repaired grandfather clock to a house near the edge of town. The owner was an old man named Arthur Gray, who lived alone among shelves of records and framed photographs. While Thomas adjusted the clock, Julian noticed that nearly every photograph showed the same woman, sometimes young, sometimes old, always smiling beside Arthur. Arthur noticed Julian looking. "That was my wife, Eleanor," he said. "She left Linden 9 years ago." Julian hesitated, unsure whether he meant she had died or simply gone away. Arthur understood the question before Julian asked. "She is alive," he said. "At least, I believe she is. She left to care for her sister. We thought it would be temporary." Julian looked around the room again. Arthur had preserved everything carefully. Eleanor's favorite chair, a blue scarf hanging by the door, a cup she had painted years ago. "Did you say goodbye?" Julian asked quietly. Arthur shook his head. "No," we said, "until spring." He smiled sadly. Spring came, then another, then another. But I still remember her. Arthur explained that Eleanor had written for the first 2 years. Then the letters became less frequent until one day they stopped. He never learned why. Perhaps she became ill. Perhaps she built another life. Perhaps the letters simply failed to arrive. "Not knowing is difficult," he said, "but forgetting her would be worse." Julian wondered whether hope could become a kind of waiting room people lived inside for too long. On the walk back, Julian asked Thomas whether Arthur had been waiting for Eleanor all those years. Thomas nodded. "In some ways." Julian looked troubled. "Is that healthy?" Thomas gave a small shrug. "People outside Linden also wait for things that may never return. Old loves, old dreams, old versions of themselves." He paused. "The difference is that here we are more honest about how hard it is to let go." That evening, Julian sat alone beside the river and thought about Arthur, Evelyn, Mara, and all the names hidden beneath the library. He was beginning to see that Linden's refusal to say goodbye had protected many memories, but it had also kept certain doors half open for years. And a door left open could offer hope, but it could also keep a person standing in the same room long after everyone else had moved on. The next morning, Julian returned to Arthur's house alone. He brought fresh bread from the bakery and found the old man sitting beside the window with Eleanor's blue scarf folded across his knees. Arthur seemed surprised to see him, but invited him in. For a while, they spoke about ordinary things. Then Julian asked the question that had stayed with him all night. What would happen if you decided to stop waiting? Arthur did not answer immediately. He ran his thumb slowly along the edge of the scarf. "I used to think waiting was the same as loving," he said. "If I stopped waiting, I was afraid it would mean she mattered less." Julian looked toward the photographs around the room. Arthur sighed. "But perhaps love does not always ask us to remain where someone left us." Julian asked whether Arthur had ever considered leaving Linden to search for Eleanor. The old man smiled faintly many times, but each time he reached the edge of town, he imagined returning to find that some part of her had faded from his memory. So he stayed. "Fear can look very much like loyalty," Arthur said quietly, "especially when you have carried it long enough." On his way back to town, Julian thought about those words. He wondered how many choices in his own life had been made from fear while wearing more respectable names: responsibility, caution, patience, timing. Linden seemed to reveal such things slowly. It did not force answers from anyone. It simply gave silence enough room for the truth to become audible. Later that afternoon, a second letter arrived from Mara. This one was shorter. She wrote that her sister had asked her to stay through winter and that she had found work near the harbor. She was happy, she said, though she missed Linden more than expected. At the bottom of the page she had written, "Tell Mother I still remember the way home." Mara's mother read the final sentence several times before pressing the letter gently against her chest. Julian noticed that no one in the room spoke about when Mara would return. They seemed to understand something he was only beginning to learn. Love did not always need a date attached to it. Sometimes it was enough to know that somewhere beyond the hills someone still carried the memory of home. That evening, Agnes asked Julian to return to the library. In the room without books, one of the drawers had been placed open on a table. It belonged to a man named Daniel Ross, who had left Linden nearly 60 years earlier. Inside was a wooden toy boat, a photograph of 3 brothers, and a letter that had arrived that very morning. The letter had been written by Daniel's daughter. Daniel had died peacefully at the age of 84, far from Linden. Before his death, he had asked her to send one message to the town where he was born: "I never forgot you." Agnes read the sentence aloud, then sat quietly. "Sometimes," she said, "the people we fear losing are carrying us with them all along." Julian looked at Daniel's small wooden boat and felt something inside him soften. For decades, Linden had preserved objects to remember a man who had been living elsewhere with memories of his own. The town had feared that distance meant erasure, but perhaps memory did not travel in only one direction. Perhaps those who left carried pieces of Linden just as Linden carried pieces of them. When Julian returned to the inn that night, he found Evelyn asleep beside the fireplace, with Samuel's faded photograph resting on the table. He covered her gently with a blanket and looked once more at the young man in the picture. Somewhere beyond everything Evelyn had forgotten, perhaps Samuel had remembered enough for both of them, and for the first time Julian wondered whether saying goodbye was truly the thing Linden should fear, or whether the deeper fear was believing that love could survive only by refusing to let anything end. The following morning, Julian told Evelyn that he had been thinking about Samuel. He did not mention the letters yet. Instead, he asked whether she believed there was a difference between remembering someone and refusing to release them. Evelyn looked toward the window for a long time. "There is," she said softly, "but when you love someone deeply, the two can feel almost the same." Julian finally told her about the letters hidden beneath the library. Evelyn did not look surprised. She simply closed her eyes and let out a slow breath. "Agnes showed them to me years ago," she said. "I read every one." Julian asked why she had never taken them home. Evelyn smiled sadly. because they belonged to a woman who remembered him better than I do now. She explained that reading Samuel's words had once made her desperate to recover every lost detail. She tried to remember his voice, the way he walked, the jokes they shared, the exact day they met. The harder she tried, the more exhausted she became. Eventually, Evelyn said, I realized I was spending the life I still had, searching for a version of myself that could no longer return. Julian asked whether that meant she had stopped loving Samuel. Evelyn shook her head. No, I stopped asking love to prove itself through pain. She placed a hand over her heart. There are things I no longer remember, but I know that knowing him changed me. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the people we love do not need to remain perfectly preserved in order to remain part of us. That afternoon, Julian returned to Arthur's house and found him packing a small suitcase. The blue scarf was folded neatly on top. Julian stopped in the doorway. Are you leaving? Arthur nodded. His hands trembled slightly, but his expression was peaceful. I have spent 9 years waiting for Eleanor to come back, he said. I think it is time I find out whether I still know how to go forward. Arthur did not know whether he would search for Eleanor or simply travel for a while. For once, he did not need a complete plan. Maybe I will find her, he said. Maybe I will find something else. Maybe I will come home in a month. He looked around the room, filled with photographs. But staying here has not kept her closer. It has only kept me in the same place. News of Arthur's departure spread quietly through Linden. By evening, several neighbors gathered outside his house with bread, warm clothing, and small gifts for the journey. No one tried to convince him to stay. No one asked him to promise when he would return. Julian noticed something different in their expressions. There was sadness, certainly, but beneath it was also a kind of respect. The next morning, Arthur stood beside the coach with his suitcase at his feet. Thomas embraced him first. Until the road brings you somewhere worth staying, he said. Agnes handed him a small notebook and told him to fill it with things he did not want to forget. Evelyn kissed his cheek. Until whenever, she whispered. Arthur smiled, but Julian could see tears gathering in his eyes. Before stepping into the coach, Arthur turned toward the town. For a moment it seemed he might say the forbidden word. The square became completely silent. Arthur opened his mouth, then smiled. "Thank you for remembering me while I was still here," he said instead. Something in the sentence moved through the crowd like a gentle wind. Several people began to cry. Julian watched the coach carry Arthur beyond the bend and felt the meaning of Linden begin to change again. Perhaps the town had spent generations believing that love could be protected by avoiding endings. But Arthur had shown him something else. There was a difference between abandoning someone and allowing them to leave, and sometimes the kindest way to hold a person in your heart was to stop holding them in place. For several days after Arthur left, Julian noticed small changes in the town. Nothing dramatic happened, yet people seemed to speak more openly about those who had gone. At the bakery, someone mentioned a brother living far away. At the fountain, an old woman told a story about a childhood friend she had not seen in 40 years. It was as though Arthur's departure had loosened something Linden had kept tightly folded for too long. Thomas noticed it too. One afternoon, while repairing a pocket watch, he said, "For years, we thought speaking about loss too often might make it stronger." He smiled without looking up from his work. Perhaps silence made it stronger instead. Julian considered that. There were many things people tried to protect by refusing to name them, only to discover that unnamed things could still shape an entire life. That evening, Julian found a third letter from Mara waiting at the Lantern house. This time, however, the envelope was addressed to him. He opened it with surprise. Mara thanked him for sitting beside her at the fountain before she left. She wrote that sometimes a stranger was easier to speak to because they carried none of the expectations of home. Near the end of the letter, Mara admitted that she did not know whether she would return to Linden. The coast had begun to feel like a life rather than a visit. She loved her family deeply, but she was discovering that loving where you came from did not necessarily mean you were meant to remain there forever. Julian read the sentence twice, feeling as though it had been written for him as much as for Mara. The final line was simple. "If I do not come back, please tell my mother that leaving was never the same as loving her less." Julian folded the letter slowly. He knew the message belonged to Mara's mother, but something about delivering it frightened him. In Linden, words about leaving carried unusual weight, and this was perhaps the closest thing to an ending Mara had allowed herself to write. The next morning, Julian visited Mara's mother. She invited him into a small kitchen filled with dried herbs, blue curtains, and photographs of two daughters at different ages. Julian handed her the letter and waited while she read. Her eyes lingered on the final sentence for a long time. Then she placed the paper carefully on the table and whispered, "I think I have been waiting for her to give me permission to stop waiting." Julian asked whether that thought made her sad. Mara's mother smiled through tears. "Of course." Then she touched one of the photographs beside her. But sadness is not always a sign that something is wrong. Sometimes sadness is simply what love feels like when it understands that it cannot keep everything. Julian remained quiet, letting the sentence settle gently between them. Before Julian left, Mara's mother surprised him by asking whether he intended to remain in Linden. He hesitated. The question had become more difficult with each passing day. "I don't know," he admitted. She nodded, as though that were a perfectly acceptable answer. "Then do not stay because you are afraid to leave," she said, "and do not leave because you are afraid to stay." Julian walked for hours after that conversation. He passed the clock shop, the library, the fountain, and the quiet streets that had become familiar to him. He realized he had begun forming memories here without noticing. Evelyn's tea, Thomas's dry humor, Agnes beneath the green reading lamp, the sound of the river at night. Linden had stopped being a mystery he wanted to solve. It had become somewhere he would miss. That realization frightened him more than anything that had happened since his arrival, because Julian finally understood the true danger of caring for a place. One day, you might have to leave it. He stood near the fountain as evening settled over Linden and listened to the familiar bells in the distance. For the first time, he wondered not whether he could say goodbye to the town, but whether the town would remember him if he did. The next morning, Julian asked Evelyn a question he had been avoiding. What happens when someone who was not born in Linden leaves? Evelyn looked at him over the rim of her teacup. The same thing that happens to anyone else, she said. If the farewell is spoken as an ending, memory begins to loosen. Julian looked toward the window. So you could forget me, too? Evelyn smiled sadly. Yes. Julian had not expected the answer to hurt. He had been in Linden only a short time, yet the thought of disappearing from these people felt strangely personal. Evelyn seemed to understand. That is the trouble with being remembered, she said. We begin to think it proves we mattered. Julian looked down at his hands. Doesn't it? Evelyn replied gently. Sometimes. But being loved and being remembered are not always the same thing. That afternoon, Julian visited Thomas and found him winding a row of clocks. He asked whether Thomas feared being forgotten. The old clockmaker smiled. When I was younger, very much. He set one clock back on the shelf. Now, I think differently. If someone forgets my name one day but becomes kinder because I once treated them kindly, perhaps some part of me remained anyway. Thomas opened the back of a small pocket watch and adjusted a tiny spring. People want memory to be permanent, he said, because permanence feels like proof. But nothing stays unchanged, not faces, not towns, not even grief. He closed the watch and handed it to Julian. Perhaps the question is not whether we are remembered forever. Perhaps it is whether our presence changed anything while we were here. Julian carried those words with him to the river. He sat beneath a willow tree and watched leaves drift across the surface. His life before Linden suddenly seemed very far away. There were people there who knew his name, yet he had not spoken honestly with some of them in years. He wondered whether being remembered by many people meant very much if he had rarely allowed himself to be truly known. As evening approached, a boy named Leo sat beside Julian without invitation. He was perhaps 10 years old and carried a wooden boat under one arm. Julian recognized it as something Thomas had repaired. Leo asked whether Julian was leaving soon. Julian smiled. Why does everyone keep asking me that? The boy shrugged. Because people who arrive from somewhere else usually belong somewhere else, too. Leo placed the wooden boat on the water and watched it drift against the bank. My brother left 2 years ago, he said. He works in a city with buildings taller than the church tower. Julian asked whether Leo missed him. Every day. The boy smiled. But Mama says missing someone is not the same as wanting them to come back. Sometimes you can miss someone and still be happy they found somewhere they wanted to be. Julian smiled at the simplicity of the answer. Adults in Linden had spent generations building rituals around departure, yet a child had expressed something they were still learning. Love did not always ask for return. Sometimes it simply wished another person well from a distance. Julian watched Leo retrieve the boat from the water and thought that perhaps letting go did not have to mean letting someone disappear. That night, Julian opened the small suitcase he had barely touched since arriving. His clothes still carried the faint scent of the road. At the bottom was a notebook containing appointments, addresses, and reminders from his old life. He turned through the pages slowly. For the first time, returning did not feel like surrendering Linden. It felt like carrying what Linden had taught him somewhere else. Julian closed the notebook and looked toward the dark window. He knew then that he would leave soon. The thought still brought sadness, but not the panic he had expected. Linden had taught him that sadness did not always mean a decision was wrong. Sometimes it simply meant the moment had become precious enough to hurt when it ended. And perhaps an ending could be both painful and right. The next morning, Julian told Evelyn that he had decided to leave before the end of the week. She listened quietly, then nodded, as if she had known before he said it. "I wondered when the road would begin calling you again," she said. Julian smiled, but his chest tightened. Linden had become easier to enter than to leave. Evelyn asked where he would go first. Julian told her he would return to the city, answer the messages he had ignored, visit someone he had postponed seeing, and perhaps finally make a few changes he had been avoiding for years. None of the plans sounded extraordinary, yet for the first time they felt like choices rather than obligations. Word of Julian's departure spread through Linden without anyone making a ceremony of it. Thomas gave him a small pocket watch that had no numbers on its face, only a single line engraved inside the cover. Time does not ask to be kept, only noticed. Agnes gave him an empty notebook and said, "Fill this with things worth remembering while they are still happening." Mara's mother prepared a small parcel of bread and dried fruit for the road. Leo gave Julian a folded paper boat and made him promise not to throw it away until he reached somewhere with water. Even people Julian barely knew stopped him in the street to wish him well. Their words were always different, but none of them closed the door completely. On his final evening, Julian walked through Linden alone. He passed the fountain where he had first spoken with Mara, the clock shop where Thomas had warned him about goodbye, and the library beneath which hundreds of memories waited in wooden drawers. He realized that a place could become part of someone without asking permission, one ordinary moment at a time. At the river, Julian found Arthur's old bench empty beneath the willow tree. He sat there until the moon appeared between the clouds. For a while, he wondered whether Arthur had found Eleanor, whether Mara would ever return, and whether Samuel had thought of Evelyn near the end of his life. Then Julian smiled. Not every unanswered question required an answer in order to have meaning. The next morning arrived clear and cool. Julian placed his suitcase in the car, while Evelyn stood beside the steps of the lantern house. Neither of them spoke for a while. Julian had imagined this moment many times, but now that it had arrived, every sentence seemed either too small or too final. Evelyn finally smiled. "You are thinking too hard about the last thing to say." Julian laughed softly. "Isn't that what everyone here does?" Evelyn shook her head. "No, we spend too much time trying to make sure nothing is ever the last." She stepped closer and straightened the collar of his coat. "Maybe that is something Linden still has to learn." Julian looked at her, surprised. For the first time, Evelyn herself seemed uncertain about the rule she had lived with all her life. Julian asked what she meant. Evelyn looked toward the quiet street. "We taught ourselves that endings were dangerous because we were afraid of forgetting. But perhaps Refuse's every ending has made us afraid of living beyond them." She turned back to Julian. "Memory may fade whether we want it to or not. That does not mean the love inside the memory was wasted." Julian stood beside his car with one hand resting on the open door. The word he had been warned never to say rose quietly in his mind. For the first time, it did not feel like a curse. It felt like a simple human acknowledgement that a moment had mattered and could not remain forever. He looked at Evelyn and realized the final lesson of Linden might begin with the very word the town feared most. For several seconds, Julian said nothing. The morning was so quiet that he could hear leaves moving along the pavement behind him. Evelyn seemed to understand the thought he was struggling with. "If you say it," she said gently, "say it because you are grateful for what was here, not because you want to erase it." Julian looked at her and realized that perhaps intention had always mattered more than the word itself. Julian stepped closer and embraced Evelyn. She felt smaller than he remembered, but there was something steady in the way she held him. "Thank you," he whispered, "for the room, the tea, the stories, and for letting me stay long enough to understand why I came." Evelyn smiled against his shoulder. "Maybe that is what places like Linden are for. Not to keep people, but to return something they had forgotten how to carry." Thomas, Agnes, Leo, and several others had quietly gathered farther down the street. No one had announced a farewell, yet somehow they had all known when to come. Julian smiled at them, feeling the strange ache of belonging to a place at the exact moment he was preparing to leave it. For once, he did not wish the moment could last forever. He only wished to be fully present while it lasted. He hugged Thomas, thanked Agnes, and promised Leo that the paper boat would reach water again. Then Julian returned to Evelyn. The word was still waiting inside him. He had spent days learning why Linden feared it, but now he understood that a farewell did not have to mean rejection, forgetting, or an absence of love. Sometimes it simply meant this mattered enough for leaving to hurt. Julian took a slow breath. "Goodbye, Evelyn." The street became completely still. No one gasped. No wind rose. No light went out. Evelyn simply looked at him, and for the briefest moment there was fear in her eyes. Then she smiled. "Goodbye, Julian." The word sounded ordinary, almost gentle, and somehow that made it more powerful than all the warnings surrounding it. Nothing happened. Julian waited for some sign that a boundary had been crossed, but the morning remained exactly as it was. Evelyn still knew his name. Thomas still smiled from the roadside. Leo still held up one hand in farewell. Julian almost laughed with relief. Perhaps Linden had feared the word for so long that nobody had stopped to ask whether the curse belonged to goodbye or to the certainty with which people once used it. Evelyn seemed to arrive at the same thought. "Maybe we misunderstood," she whispered. "Maybe goodbye was never a command to forget." Julian nodded. "Maybe it only became one when people used it to mean, you are no longer part of me." Evelyn looked toward the town she had lived in all her life. "Then perhaps we have been blaming a word for something our hearts were doing." Julian got into his car and started the engine. This time, the road beyond Linden appeared clearly on the map. Before driving away, he looked once more at the people standing outside the lantern house. He did not promise to return. They did not ask him to. There was something unexpectedly peaceful about leaving the future open without using hope as a reason to avoid the truth of the present. As Julian drove beyond the old stone marker, he watched Linden grow smaller in the mirror. The roofs disappeared first, then the church tower, then the final amber lights between the trees. He felt sadness rise inside him, but he allowed it to remain. He no longer believed sadness needed to be fixed. Some sadness was simply evidence that something beautiful had been allowed to matter. Several miles later, Julian stopped beside a quiet lake. He took Leo's paper boat from his coat, placed it carefully on the water, and watched it drift away from the shore. He thought of everyone in Linden, then whispered the word once more, "Goodbye." This time, it did not feel like closing a door. It felt like placing a memory gently into the world and trusting that love did not need possession in order to remain real. The lake remained still long after the paper boat had disappeared from sight. Julian stood at the water's edge, watching the ripples fade until the surface became smooth again. He realized that this was what endings often did. They disturbed us for a while, then slowly became part of the larger quiet. The moment did not vanish. It simply stopped demanding to be held. When Julian returned to the city, everything looked exactly as he remembered and slightly different at the same time. Traffic moved through familiar streets, people hurried beneath office lights, and his apartment waited with the same furniture in the same places. Yet Julian no longer felt as though he had returned to the life he left. He felt as though he had returned to it carrying different eyes. He answered messages he had postponed, called an old friend, and visited his sister on a Sunday afternoon without waiting for a special reason. He listened more carefully than before. When conversations ended, he did not rush to the next thing. He began noticing how often people treated ordinary moments as if they were guaranteed to happen again. Sometimes Julian still thought about Linden before falling asleep. He wondered whether Evelyn remembered his face, whether Thomas still repaired clocks beneath the same window, and whether Agnes had added new names to the room without books. He did not know. Strangely, the uncertainty no longer troubled him. He had stopped believing that love required constant proof in order to remain meaningful. Months later, a small envelope appeared in Julian's mailbox without a return address. Inside was a single photograph of the Lantern House beneath fresh snow. On the back, someone had written, "We remember enough. We hope you do, too." Julian recognized Evelyn's handwriting immediately. He smiled and placed the photograph beside his bed. Years passed. Some memories of Linden grew softer at the edges. Julian could no longer remember the exact sound of the church bells or the color of every house along the main street. But he remembered how the town had made him feel. He remembered warm tea, quiet roads, and the strange relief of learning that an ending did not have to erase what came before it. One evening, Julian found Thomas's pocket watch in a drawer and opened the cover. The engraved words were still there. Time does not ask to be kept, only noticed. He sat quietly with the watch in his palm and thought about all the people who had passed through his life. Some stayed, some left, some were gone. None of them had remained unchanged, and neither had he. Julian finally understood that remembering was never the same as freezing something in time. Memory changed because people changed. Details faded, emotions softened, and stories were retold differently as the years passed. But perhaps that did not make them less true. Perhaps a memory did not need to remain perfect to continue shaping the person who carried it. And so, whenever someone he loved had to leave, Julian stopped searching for the perfect final sentence. Sometimes he said, "Until next time." Sometimes he said, "Take care." And sometimes, when the moment truly called for it, he simply said goodbye. He had learned that the word itself was not cruel. What mattered was whether the heart used it to erase or to honor what had been shared. Perhaps that is what Linden had been trying to teach all along. We cannot keep every person, every place, or every moment exactly as it was. Some things leave, some memories fade, some doors close whether we are ready or not. But goodbye does not have to mean that love has ended. Sometimes it simply means, this mattered, I will carry what I can, and now I am willing to let the road continue.